Good afternoon and welcome to the Center's Reckoning to Rise series starting here again in 2022. We are so very excited to have all of you here joining us on today for this important conversation. More than 600 people have signed up for this conversation, which tells us just how much you understand the role of tax policy and ensuring that every policy in our country is grounded in a framework of racial equity, inclusion, which requires anti-racist actions. I'm Tawana Black. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion. We are your partners in helping to drive shared accountability for closing racial wealth gaps and building regional economies that truly work for everyone by placing the actions of policymakers, government agency leaders, and those leaders in the private sector in our top radar so that we can focus on the actions that must be undone and those new actions and policies and investments that must take place in our economy in order to truly build that economy that works for everyone and ensures regions like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Illinois, Nashville, Tennessee, and everywhere else in the country are thriving because of our racial equity and inclusion, not in spite of it. I am thrilled to have this conversation with you all today and want to share just a bit as we get started about what you can expect. Many of you I know have partnered with us and attended our Reckoning to Rise series over the last year. Plus, you've participated in our Powering Inclusion Conference, and you're doing the hard work of changing not only hearts and minds, but the hard work of changing the organizations where you work. Building racially equitable and inclusive workplaces requires all of us working in solidarity, and that is the work that my team and I are blessed to do here at the Center for Economic Inclusion. I want to give a big shout out as we jump in to our team at the Center for Economic Inclusion. We are 25 strong and growing in order to meet the demands of policymakers and employers across the country who are ready to take different actions than we've taken before in order to get different results. This team of people work very hard every day to spur your organizations with innovation, creativity, equity, and inclusion in order to build that workplace and ultimately that world that we all aspire to have. And I'm so honored to be able to work with each and every one of them. I'm also grateful for the partners who are in this work with us and want to do a little bit of highlighting as we talk about those partners today. The Minnesota Department of Revenue and the Minnesota Budget Project have been tremendous assets for us in bringing this opportunity to us. They have a focus on expanding public engagement efforts, increasing awareness about how our taxes and our tax structure relate to the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, and also a deep commitment to enhancing our analysis of tax data and capabilities in order to strive to build a community, a state, in fact, where we can increase access to income-boosting refundable tax credits and are making sure this is a priority, not only for Commissioner Robert Doty, a great partner and friend, but also for all those that he is leading inside the Department of Revenue, those departments that are attached and working with them in partnership, and Governor Tim Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, our partners. Each one of these leaders are echoing this priority, not only in convenings and places like this, but throughout their day-to-day work, because that's what it takes. Actions in solidarity and shared accountability with our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian communities working to build an economy that does work for everyone so that our state has a solid and competitive future. The intersections of economic inclusion, wealth, and taxes are deeply embedded into the work, not only at the department in the state of Minnesota, but into the work that Professor Dorothy Brown leads every day and is amplifying across the world. I'm excited for this opportunity to continue our discussion, and we want to lift up a few tools just to help you out. First, as you know, we always take an opportunity in order to lift up businesses in our community who are available for your lunch. So we want to encourage you to take advantage of our website where you can see links to several restaurants owned by our communities of color that are ensuring that our community continues to thrive. Don't take a step back at this time and maybe buy less. We want you to invest even more. So order your lunch for today. But more than that, be sure you're thinking about all of those convenings and get-togethers that you're doing safely, and make sure that you're considering these businesses for your catering. I also want to thank our sponsors. Many businesses and foundations across the country have stepped up to invest in this work. This year, we're reckoning to rise for wealth equity even more and more aggressively than before. We're focusing heavily, as you'll see in our next event in just a few days now, next week, that we're also focusing deeply on the role that businesses owned by our communities of color play in closing that racial wealth gap. And we're thankful to all of these partners and sponsors, highlighting first our lead partner and sponsor, the Kauffman Foundation, and all that you see on our screen with Allianz, Best Buy, Bush Foundation, Kresge Foundation, and Barde, who are stepping up to make sure our community continues to thrive. We're grateful as well to those partners who are investing not only in this work, but in all of the work at the Center for Economic Inclusion, as well as our clients. And we say a big thank you to each one of you and encourage you. This is the time to be acting with our power. This is the time to consider those businesses whose values, acted values, those values that show up in their dollars and cents and their commitments show up in our lives. So as you consider where you can spend your dollars, where you can consider for employment opportunities, where you should be pursuing business opportunities, consider those businesses that are investing not only in our organizations, but in the work of building an economy that truly works for everyone. Now it's time for us to hear from you. We've got some questions as always, because this work is about us doing the work together. More than 600 people have signed up for this today, and we've got well over 500 right now. So I want to encourage you, you should see a poll on your screens right now. Help us find out who's in the room. Tell us a bit about who you are and how you show up in the world and identify, but also tell us a bit about how you're making a difference with what we bring to the table. These convenings and workshops are not simply to convene and hear amazing speakers, which we do every time we come together. But more than that, we've listened to you about what you need to move from awareness about disparities, awareness about the economic imperative for closing racial wealth gaps, to taking that deep action in solidarity with one another. So continue to provide us feedback, both here in the poll. We'll give you a little bit of time to complete this poll. And at the end of today's workshop, we'll also have a survey for you. We want your insight about the programming that we'll deliver all year long. We've got an exciting and power-packed agenda for the entire year, including Reckoning to Rise workshops every Thursday in February, just as we did last year. And our summit will be back as we come to you here in June to celebrate all that we've accomplished over this 5-year journey, but also to make sure that we're giving everyone the tools that we need to do deeper, more sustainable, more measurable impact inside our organizations. Hopefully you've had a chance now to complete that poll and are giving us your responses, and we'll be taking those in and showing those in the final results. You can see here now who's in the room. We have a racially diverse group here on today, matching a bit like our footprint of where we serve. We're excited for that. We have diversity in our racial and ethnic makeup. We have diversity in our age makeup. We have a diversity in our gender identity and makeup and composition. And we have, increasing diversity in terms of the number of you who are here for the first time, 69%. Welcome to the Center for Economic Inclusion, Reckoning to Rise. And the number of you who have continued to be a part of this work month after month, week after week, day after day, and are here again. We're so excited to have you with us. We also gave you an opportunity to tell us a bit about what you're taking action on. And I'm thrilled to see that your relationships are at the center of this work. It takes us building relationships and trust and solidarity with one another in order to undo those policies and practices that have not been in play in order to drive equity. We're excited that you have an opportunity to consider the ways that we can continue to move our economy forward together. And we're excited to dig into this conversation. Now, I want to highlight a couple more things for you. As you all know, many of you have come to know about us through social media. We want to continue today's conversation on social media land as well. So we invite you, drop us a line. You see our handles here on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. You can contact us in any of these ways, but we'd love you to expand this conversation so that not just the 600 of us have it, but we're having it out in the ecosystem as we learn more about what it takes to build that economy that is truly working for all of us. We also will have dropped into the chat a couple of times the handles for our speakers and their organizations. We want to lift them up here on today and continue to amplify them and give you an opportunity to continue the conversation with each one of them out inside our communities. We are excited to go even deeper now in acknowledging the way that we're going to go forward. And I'm excited now to begin introducing our speaker and bringing the topic of the hour into the room. Dorothy Brown is Aisha Griggs Candler Professor of Law at Emory University School of Law and an advocate for the economic and social justice. She is the author of The Whiteness of Wealth. Hopefully you've gotten your book. She's the author of The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It. She is well known in her work on the effects of tax policy by race, class, and gender, and workplace equity and inclusion and law school reform. She is also the author of the path-breaking Critical Race Theory, Cases, Materials, and Problems, currently in its third edition, which applies a racial lens to the foundational law school courses such as contracts, property, civil, and criminal law procedure. You have likely seen her already on CNN, MSNBC, Bloomberg, because she's also written several pieces that have been highlighted more and more in the media now, addressing the current events in the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN Opinion, Washington Post, Forbes, National Law Journal, and Bloomberg View, just to name a few. We couldn't be more honored for this opportunity to have this conversation with a leader who is using all of this expertise and knowledge in order to change our economy. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining me on today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. I have to tell you, I am total in fangirl mode right now. The way that you have leveraged not only your personal knowledge and journey and experience, the wisdom that you have about our communities and how we show up in the marketplace, and then the legal and tax background. And I've heard just a little bit about the journey that you've been on, and I'm excited to bring that to the fore on today. So I'm going to jump right in. In December, the U.S. Treasury announced plans to analyze the race and equity implications of tax policy. We want to salute you because we know if it weren't for the elevation of this work that you've done, finding and digging through ways to analyze tax data through a lens of race, that may not be occurring. So a big hats off and salute. And many people in our audience might be thinking about, okay, how does this even work? If I don't give information about who I am, how can race have anything to do with tax policy? I want to start there and ask you, can you give us a little bit of insight about how race shows up in our taxes and tax policy, and what led you down this pathway?
So as I like to say, taxpayers in America bring their racial identity onto their tax returns. They don't have to do anything other than put their name and address. And we know housing segregation, right? We know how racism operates. So I actually am a reluctant participant in this work. I went into tax law thinking it had nothing to do with race. I went into tax law specifically because I thought it had nothing to do with race. So I grew up in the South Bronx. My mother was a nurse, my father was a plumber, and I dealt with racism all the time. And I didn't want a job that the law had to do with racism. So I thought, tax law, that's it. I'll do tax law because the only color that matters is green. So I'm doing my parents' tax returns like any good daughter with an LLM in tax would. And I'm doing my tax returns and I'm looking at their tax returns and something's not adding up. Now, my parents made roughly equal amounts, which is going to be important to the story. I don't know anything other than I'm kind of rooting for my mother to make more money from my father. And one year she would, and then the next year she wouldn't. And it depended on how much overtime daddy made as to who would make most. But closely 50-50 is how they contributed. And each of them made about half of what I made. So yes, my taxes were higher, but they weren't a lot higher. And every time I did my parents' tax returns, I believed something was wrong, but I couldn't figure it out. Well, I had a job. I was an investment banker on Wall Street. I didn't really have time to sit around and figure it out. I did their taxes. I did mine, sent them in, moved on. Well, I became a law professor in 1991. And a few years after that, I read an article by a mentor that I thought had nothing to do with tax. And it was an article where he was arguing that Black law professors should look at race and systemic racism in whatever area of the law they taught. Again, I thought it had nothing to do with me because I teach tax and it doesn't have anything to do with race. Well, I get to like 2 pages from the end and there's a hypothetical question in there and it says, how do you know there isn't a race and tax issue if you don't look? And I thought, race and tax? Really? He was a mentor. He was brilliant. He always taught me something whenever I listened to him. So I picked up the phone. I called him. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something. Because if you said it might be there, I'm going to look. Well, easier said than done. Because that's when I learned the IRS doesn't publish statistics by race. So how on earth would I ever keep this promise that I made to my mentor, given that the IRS doesn't publish statistics by race? So that was the dilemma that I faced, Tawana.
I love that this dilemma started with a personal piece because there's that conviction, that motivation. And I think sometimes in this work, broadly, people can look at like, oh, what is it? Is it a person who's just angry and after the government, or they're just angry and after employers in my case, right? But to understand, wait a minute, no, I'm looking at the data and something just doesn't add up. I'm trying to dig even more and more. And I think that's so much a reflection of what we see in many places. Wait, the data isn't telling us the full story. What did you find as you dug in?
Well, what I found was, what I had to become was a detective, right? Because the IRS doesn't publish data, but we know all kinds of government agencies publish data. So what I did was anything I could get my hands on that had to do with race, I would put my tax lenses to work. And I came across a Commission on Civil Rights report on the economic status of Black women. And there was a line in the report that said, Black wives contribute like 41% to household income, and white wives contribute 29%. Now, to anybody else, they're like, yeah, Black wives work more. Yeah, next. But to the tax law professor and me, I'm like, oh my God, this is my parents. Because what I know is when husbands and wives or partners, although at the time we didn't recognize same-sex marriages, with spouses earning roughly equal amounts, the marriage penalty exists. And the marriage penalty is when I'm single, I pay taxes at X level. When I get married, I pay taxes at X plus level. I pay higher taxes when I get married. That's called a marriage bonus. If when I get married, I pay lower taxes, I'm sorry, that's called a marriage penalty. If when I get married, I pay lower taxes, that's called the marriage bonus. And if a husband and a wife contribute 50-50, like my parents, it means they're paying higher taxes when they get married. And it was like, oh my gosh, that's why I thought something was wrong. My parents were paying higher taxes because they were married to each other.
This takes my mind into so many directions. One, right, the social implications of this, because certainly people may not have the background that you have, right? But generally, you're doing your taxes and you're, hold on, something just doesn't, it's not adding up. It's not adding up. So people are making likely informed choices, but informed with a portion, because if you can play the game, you have to have the entire deck of information, the entire set of rules, right? And understand that. Some of what you found, I know, in Elevate in the book and your writings, is also about just how these policies, though, show up time and time again, whether we're talking about, in this case, employment, it has an impact there, but also in education and housing. Take us deeper.
So let's talk about marriage and the joint return, right? So most people know if you get married, there's a joint return, the two people can file one return. It used to not be like that. In fact, when our modern progressive income tax system came into play in 1913, everybody filed as an individual. There wasn't any special break for marriage. So how did we get here? We got here because of a couple, Charlotte and Henry Seaborn from Seattle, Washington. In 1927, they decided they were sick of paying taxes. Sound familiar, right? But in 1927, only about 5% of Americans pay taxes. Let me say that again. Only about 5% of Americans pay taxes. Only the richest Americans pay taxes. Everybody else didn't. And in 1927, surprise, surprise, there are largely white Americans mainly paying taxes. And they didn't like it. And he was a single wage earner and she was a stay-at-home spouse. And he had income from work and income from investments. And he and his tax advisors thought of the following scheme. If I can shift half of my income to my wife and have her included on her return, my return coupled with her return is going to result in lower taxes. So that's what we're going to do. The law doesn't let us do it, but we're going to do it because that's how we roll. We're the Seaborns, right? So they file what I would argue is a fraudulent return, two returns. The IRS says you can't do that. There's no such thing as a joint return. You can't do that. They go to court and they go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says because the state of Washington is a community property state, she ineffectively has a right to half of everything he has. So yeah, you can do it. Well, if you lived in a community property state and you were one of that 5% paying taxes, you just got a tax break because of the Seaborns. But if you lived in a separate property state, no tax break for you. So depending on where you lived in 1930, when the Supreme Court case came down, would determine whether you, part of the 5%ers, got a tax break or not. Well, guess what? Rich white folks who weren't living in community property states did not like that. And they had two options. One was to go to their state legislature and get the law changed from separate property to community property. Now, that's a good thing, but it meant the mainly men had to now share economic and legal rights with their spouses. So lots of men didn't like that. What they did as an alternative to state courthouses or state legislatures was go to Congress, and we got the joint return. So in 1948, Congress gave all married couples the ability to shift income to their stay-at-home spouse and get a tax break. The problem was, even in 1948, a higher percentage of Black married couples were two equal wage earner households and not single wage earner households like the Seaborns. So we knew back when the joint return was enacted in 1948, this was going to benefit white Americans more than Black Americans.
Absolutely. I see our chat blowing up. People are astounded, as we all should be here. This isn't things that you're taught in civics class or history or finance class, or economics.
Or when you get an LLM tax. I was not taught this, okay?
I love that you stress that it took becoming a detective to get this information, which makes one question why information is buried, right? So why are these things buried? It's out there. Why does it take becoming a detective in order to solve a problem we started with, which was one close to home? Parents' taxes, something isn't equaling. It's not adding up here. What am I missing? And how all of us pay a major price when we have institutions that are meant for the people, but have been designed to benefit some of the people. And we don't have information to know how to go dig that up. Can you take us even deeper? We know here in Minnesota, many of our partners who are on the line who are in other states, we're all often competing for being the worst of the worst as it relates to employment for African Americans, the wage gap for African Americans, our home ownership gaps, right? All of our racial and ethnic groups, but going back particularly to where exclusion has been built into our policies in order to elevate the whiteness of wealth, in order to hinder and slow down any wealth progression in our communities of color. Talk to us about how this is showing up in the various domains where folks might be working and trying to solve for, and what it takes in order to even bring it to the forefront and solve it through tax policy.
So yes, I have different chapters on marriage and home ownership and jobs and how to build wealth through inheritances and how tax breaks are for the stock market. So it's multi-layered, right? And I'm going to talk about a few of those. But when we think about the data, it's really problematic that our tax laws that are economy-wide, there is no area that tax doesn't impact, yet that's the area that no racial demographic data is found. Like, we know about mass incarceration because of data that's public. We know about who's getting the COVID vaccine and who isn't because of demographic data that's published. We know who rides bicycles by racial demographics, but we don't know tax, right? So part of it is a conscious attempt to not provide the information. So what the IRS's policy is, well, we don't know race, so we can't discriminate. Now, let me push back on that, because what ProPublica has shown us is audits are disproportionately hitting Black taxpayers in the rural South. People who apply for the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a tax credit for low-income wage earners. The IRS doesn't collect statistics by race, but somehow they are targeting Black taxpayers. How could that be? Because the IRS says we don't collect statistics by race. But when you fill out a tax return, there are things you put on there. You put your name and you put your zip code. And there's all kinds of research that shows you can do an analysis of zip codes and surnames. So the idea that because the IRS and Treasury aren't collecting it doesn't mean Black Americans aren't getting harmed is problematic. And in terms of the timing of that Treasury announcement, so I have a theory. My theory as to why Treasury did something in December, which was a very mild something. They're gonna work on giving data on COVID relief, which is nothing. That's not tax analysis, right? That's not who takes advantage of the preference for capital gains by racial demographic. That's not that. Why I believe Treasury did something, in addition to every time I went on TV, I called them out. In addition to that, the GAO is coming out with a study this year. So I was interviewed by the GAO over the summer. And Treasury, I believe, didn't want the GAO beating them to the punch because Senator Wyden, it's my understanding, asked the GAO to put together some information about racial demographics and demographics generally in tax. So, the Treasury is a reluctant partner, and we have to still keep their feet to the fire because there's this presumption. I'll tell you another story. So I'm presenting my marriage penalty bonus work at a law professor conference of tax law professors. And the first comment I got was, Dorothy, everybody knows your work is irrelevant because Blacks are poor and don't pay a lot in taxes. So there's this notion that all Black people are poor and our progressive tax system helps the poor. Well, one, it's not true because we're auditing the poor to death. And two, our earned income tax credit is very complicated and it's not as helpful as it could be. But there's this idea that Black people are disproportionately poor, our tax laws help them. We don't need to know that racial data. When what my book shows is Black middle class homeowners get treated differently than white middle class homeowners. Black middle class workers get treated differently under our tax system than white middle class workers.
I am struck by a couple of things that you've elevated. I want to go into those. And I'm also seeing the chat do exactly what we thought it would do, which for some people, it is hard to say, okay, but this is not about Black and white. This is about green. It's about money. So what could it be? And I believe you started in that same place. But when we look at each one of these benefits, if you will, right, that are often framed as it's a benefit. Yeah, we saw some discrimination. We saw some undue harm. And so we've created something here to benefit communities without going back to the beginning, where exclusion has been baked into our policies intentionally. Those benefits don't undo the harm that has existed, whether we're talking about housing and home ownership, our laws that incentivize in some ways and penalize in others in terms of our purchasing decisions, our rental decisions, our job decisions, where we get a job, the types of jobs we get, whether or not we're graduating from college. Help put a fine point on this. Why is this, though, tied to the whiteness of wealth? Okay. And not only tax policy, and if you get married, you'll do a little bit better if you do your taxes like that.
So let's talk about jobs, right? So jobs come with tax-free benefits. Jobs come with retirement accounts, which allow you to build wealth, and jobs come with, and they're tax-free, and jobs can come with tax-free health insurance, which prevent you from depleting your wealth. So we have these tax benefits associated with work, and what we see are occupational segregation, right? So the labor market has what I call white jobs and Black jobs, right? Disproportionate jobs that disproportionately are held by white Americans versus jobs that are disproportionately held by Black Americans. The jobs that are disproportionately held by white Americans, I have one, law professor. Those are the jobs that come with tax-free benefits, health insurance, retirement accounts, okay? So I have wealth today because I have one of those tax-advantaged white jobs. Whereas my father, for example, who was a plumber and was shut out of the plumbers union because he was Black for years, didn't have health insurance or retirement account until he ultimately, was a plumber for over 20 years before he was able to get that benefit. So my parents weren't able to build wealth because they had jobs that didn't come with those tax-free benefits. So that's just one example of how getting access to a job opens up wealth opportunities, and those jobs have different have different people who take them or who receive them based on race.
Absolutely. I appreciate that going in to define what is a white job, what is a Black job. If we were to look at neighborhoods, we would see the same, right? The penalties that Black people are paying for living in Black neighborhoods. We've covered that here at our Reckoning series before, for whether it's wealth extraction or tax policy, many penalties built in for wanting to live amongst one's own if those neighborhoods are then zoned or considered less affluent, less good, if you will. And then the benefits to living in a white neighborhood, and whether or not those benefits flow in an equitable way, or working in a white job, and do those benefits flow in equitable ways. And I have to underscore the generational impact here. You've taken us back now multiple generations, but the consequences of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents not having the opportunity to build wealth in the same ways, not only through exclusion, but again, underscoring this policy that has been built into our systems, choices that have been made by policymakers. And I know we've got a lot here who are listening and learning on today with us. What should be happening today as we gain this information? If I'm a policymaker, if I'm a state legislator, I'm a county commissioner, I'm a federal legislator, if I am voting soon, if I am an employer and a supervisor, how do I start to take this insight and information and marry it with the decisions that I've got to make?
So first, I talk about, we have a system that discriminates, right? And the question is, when you're playing defense in that kind of a system, what do you do? So I always tell people to make intentional decisions. So when you buy a home, for example, think about the neighborhood you're going to buy a home. If you want to live around racially diverse, if you want to live around Black neighbors or in an all Black neighborhood, your home is not going to be valued as much as if you were the only Black family in an all white neighborhood. Sociology research shows us that, and it's partly a carryover of redlining, but it's also a 21st century indicia of white preferences. White homeowners prefer to live in predominantly white neighborhoods. So if you know this, then recognize if you live with a lot of Black people, you are not going to get as much out of your home as if you lived in an all white neighborhood. So what does that mean? You don't become house poor. You don't put all of your money into that home. You save some of your money, you buy a less expensive home, and you max out on your retirement benefits, or you start a retirement account, or you start a 529 college savings account for your child. If, however, you want to live in, you want your home to be to be a good financial investment, then you decide you want to live with a lot of white neighbors. And you have to take precautions because your neighbors may call the cops on you, because your children may be targeted for discipline in schools when they're just engaging in the same behavior their white peers are. You have to bring a level of vigilance to that neighborhood. So if you're Black and you want to buy a home, you have all of these questions to run through in your head that you wouldn't have to if you were a white American. So I tell people to be defensive players in a system that's not designed for Black wealth.
If I could remember to take myself off mute. I love that. I am excited about the moving to the action piece here. And at this point, I want to welcome in our fellow panelists for a conversation with you on this topic. At this point, I'll introduce first Robert Doty, who is our commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Revenue, where he oversees the day-to-day operations for an agency with more than 1,400 employees, managing 30 different taxes and collecting over $26 billion annually across our state. Before joining the Department of Revenue in 2019, Robert Doty was the executive director of the Minnesota State Lottery and has also served as the chief operations officer and CFO for the Minneapolis Public Schools. I also want to introduce now Nan Madden, who is the director of the Minnesota Budget Project, an initiative of the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits that identifies and promotes public policies to expand opportunity and economic security to all Minnesotans. Nan is a recognized expert in tax policy and has helped secure substantial improvements in Minnesota's state earned income tax credit and the renter's credit. She is the author of numerous publications on tax and economic security issues. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'm thrilled to introduce my friend and partner, David McGee, who is a financial consultant and executive director of Build Wealth Minnesota, an organization that he founded in 2004 to provide financial literacy, credit awareness, homebuyer education, jobs and training resources, an organization that is transforming the equity in our home ownership across the state, and one whose mission is to promote sustainable social and economic wealth creation to underserved communities. Welcome to each one of you. Thank you so much for joining us on today for this conversation. I want to start by just asking you, what are you thinking about right now? I'll start with you, David, and ask what resonated for you based on your experience helping communities, particularly our communities of color, build wealth. And what do you shine back on when you think back over your generation of work in our communities to build wealth in Black communities? What's sticking out for you right now?
Thanks for having me, Twana, and I appreciate the Center for Economic Inclusion actually having and hosting a discussion like this. And definitely, Dorothy, I appreciate. I said you said we can't call you professor because class is not in session, but I sure feel like I was just in school. But anyway, I just appreciate some of the last information. I've been a banker for 39 years and an underwriter who's really the person who decides whether or not you get a loan for much of my career, and trained underwriters who are currently underwriting around the world. A great percentage of those were people of color because there weren't a lot of underwriters of color. But a lot that resonated me towards the last part of your statement about systems that have been in place for years. Underwriting criteria and guidelines were created for white people, and the same systems are in place today. 80, 90 years later, they're basically the same identical guidelines that were created. Well, they weren't created for Black people. And Black people come up from different challenges around predatory practice, redlining, different generational challenges as it relates to us being behind in almost every area of our lives around wealth. And so that kind of resonated. Also, I was really interested, you were talking about things being baked in and talking about policy. I've been working since 2005 trying to address home ownership disparities here in the state of Minnesota, by the way, that are some of the worst in the country, and looking at opportunities to address those through different initiatives and different programming. We actually had Governor Dayton sign in the law, a home law, that helped us to try to address bringing in more comprehensive education, and also a loan program that was a little different than existing loan programs that could get people into home ownership, mainly people of color and Black folks that hadn't had opportunities and had been against some things. But there's different things baked into the law where they can just use the word will or shall or may, as opposed to definitely will in certain parts of law. I was just so intrigued about some of the things she was saying about the married couples and things that were baked in that we just didn't know. And there's a lot of systems that are out there and laws on the books and policy that has been created that we could use to begin to address some of the disparities that aren't even being used because they're not being policed and they're not being activated or used or advocated for to bring about change in our communities to start building wealth.
Absolutely. I totally appreciate that, David. I'm going to invite you to turn your camera on. Our audience has loved everything that you've said, but they want to be sure they can see you as well. Wonderful. Thank you for that. I want to go over to you now, Commissioner Doty. Talk to us about first some level setting of what motivated you to partner with the Center for Economic Inclusion on this discussion, what you're seeing, and more importantly, what you're doing at the Department of Revenue for our state to address some of the issues that Dr. Brown just spoke about on today, and what are your plans to advance racial equity in our policies and administration?
Sorry about that. Thank you, Twana, for having me here today. This is just an incredible conversation, and I really appreciate some of what I've already heard from Dorothy Brown. First of all, what has motivated me is some of the, as Dorothy Brown has spoke about, some of my own personal experiences in my own personal journey, and understanding the impact of disparities, and how that impacted people I know, how it impacted my family, my neighbors, and things. So it's really about the personal journey that I've had. I want to talk a little bit, though, to answer your question about some of the work that we're doing at the Department of Revenue around this whole topic. So first of all, I would say that our equity work at the Department of Revenue is really based on, in my mind, two basic assumptions. First, we recognize that communities across the state have very diverse and complex tax situations, economic realities, and different perspectives. Second, we acknowledge that historical disparities, such as those that Dorothy Brown has identified, have had and continue to have profound effects on the overall equity outcomes from our tax system that are realized by various communities across the state. So some of the things that we're specifically doing, one is that we're working to increase awareness and understanding, both internally within the department as well as externally, of the correlations really between tax policy and the racial wealth gap here in Minnesota. Secondly, we are developing equity benchmarks and guidelines and working to embed these across the department in our administrative and decision-making processes. Thirdly, we are enhancing our tax data and our tax data analysis capabilities to allow us to utilize race and ethnicity data to better understand why more taxpayers from ethnic, immigrant, and ESL communities are not taking full advantage of certain tax benefits offered through our system, such as refundable credits here in Minnesota. This work will allow us to drill down on issues related to access, education, and overall participation rates. Fourthly, we're also working to increase access for all communities to revenue decision makers. We are establishing a new unit within the department to specifically focus on stakeholder engagement. It's important that we build stronger relationships with all communities, specifically ethnic, immigrant, and ESL communities, to provide them a seat at our decision-making table. We need to hear from them to understand equity issues and barriers, and we need to receive their input on policy formulation and administration. And finally, we're continuing to support the Volunteer Income Tax Administration, or VITA, program sites across the state. And for those who may not know, these programs provide provide free tax preparation services for seniors, as well as those meeting certain income guidelines. So we are busy at the Department of Revenue, and equity is something that we are trying to apply to all of our work.
Which is exactly the way that it has to be done. Thank you so much for that, Commissioner. I am struck by it. I think our audience is, from what I'm seeing in the chat, the diversity of the strategies that you're applying, from ensuring that you have those assessments and benchmarks, doing the analysis, as was just raised by Dorothy, that is necessary to understand where is racism so deeply embedded into our policies and structures that a program won't help, and analyzing why we see that some of the benefits we have, our communities are not taking advantage of, which only takes us back to that research. And lastly, really have deep appreciation for that investment in the talent inside the department, who will be responsible for that outreach and engagement inside communities, creating transparent government and accountable government. We know starts with those relationships, and really applaud the leadership that you're doing right now. I want to come over to Nan for a moment. Nan, you're at the Minnesota Budget Project and have advocated for and worked on many issues across these different arenas that Dorothy covered earlier, from education to our jobs and employment, our communities, and our tax structure. Talk to us about what our states should be doing right now to unleash the power of the tax code in order to drive racial equity and inclusive economic growth.
Yeah, sure. I really want to echo the importance of collecting the additional data and the additional stakeholder input that have already been discussed. But we also really need to realize in tax policy world that we've got enough to go on. We need to start to jump in and move forward in policies that advance racial equity and a more inclusive economy. You know, some of the things that states can be doing now based on what we already know, we already know about the deep racial disparities in wealth and the unequal access to multi-generational gifts and inheritances inheritances are one factor contributing to that. So the estate tax is one of the few ways our tax system taxes wealth today. And states can be strengthening their estate and inheritance taxes so that they aren't compounding the problem of intergenerational wealth that's already out there in the economy. We already know that there's a wide racial disparities in home ownership. So states really should be taking a look at their tax policies related to home ownership. There's many ways that states subsidize homeowners, but don't provide the same kind of support for renters. So I think there's an important role here for states to strengthen their property tax refunds for renters. Many states have work to do to make those more comprehensive, as Minnesota's is. And also really need to dismantle some of the barriers that keep some homeowners from accessing the tax benefits that do exist. Often that's because of immigration status. I think states need to be thinking about focusing their home ownership strategies on more effectively supporting those who are facing the greatest barriers. And the best solutions may not be the tax policies we've looked at in the past. So for example, lots of folks have raised questions over time about whether the mortgage interest deduction is getting a lot of bang for the buck in terms of promoting home ownership. And today it's reaching an even smaller set of homeowners than some of the 2017 federal tax reform. You know, we already know that there's deep racial disparities in income and the ability to build savings. And I think here, states can do a lot to improve and support the financial standing of lower income workers and families through things like their state earned income tax credits and other tax credits that are focused on everyday families. And I think it's really exciting to think about how states can learn from the success of the federal child tax credit expansion, which has had phenomenal impact in reducing child poverty. And are there ways we can learn from that and ways that states could perhaps provide tax benefits on a monthly schedule rather than waiting till the end of the year? You know, and we just already know that the primary purpose of the tax system is to raise the money needed to sustainably invest in public services like strong schools, affordable housing, healthcare, other ways we build a prosperous and shared prosperity. But if we are underinvesting, especially in communities of color, that creates gaps in opportunities. So states need to be raising enough revenues to fund those investments needed, and a progressive tax system is the most equitable way to do so. I think something states need to be careful about in this current environment is that we can't be doing large tax cuts for folks who are already really succeeding, instead of making the transformational investments that we need in our state's more equitable future.
I truly appreciate that, Nan. Thank you. And not only the diversity of arenas that you just talked about, but the nitty gritty, right? Sometimes good policy does not produce good results. We can layer in words that sound like they're going to hit large swaths of our community and still only see a small percentage of our communities come forward. And I think the intel that Dorothy has raised here for us about the ways that tax policy shows up and creates an undue burdens on African-American families, for instance, if you're choosing to live in a majority Black neighborhood, even the compounding impacts if you make a different choice now, but have already paid the price of wealth being extracted through our tax policies into the future requires us to quote you back again, that not just the good things that we have to do, but really being intentional and naming names, being clear in our policies about where we're trying to right some of the wrongs. Because to your point, we can have great revenues. We're in a state right now that's coming out of a great budget year, but if we're not intentional about how we invest those dollars back to solve for not only our future, but to consider the harm that has been done over generations, we won't produce the economy we want. David, I want to come over to you for just a moment. We've talked today about the gaps in home ownership. We've talked about tax policy and how it impacts home ownership, but also the need to be considering the impacts of tax policy on our renters as well, and how the choices we make, the choices sometimes we begin to feel forced to make in order to grow our wealth, to have a community that surrounds us, whether at home or at our workplaces, that allows us to thrive, is all impacted by this. You work at the intersections of home ownership and building wealth every day. You're a banker by trade and know the history of this legislation and the policies behind it. Where are you wrestling right now as you think about the great work that is happening in organizations like yours and our peers here, and yet the great burdens that we have to work together to overcome?
We're still, we're wrestling with access to capital as a nonprofit ran by, a person of color. and our board. We're specifically a person of color. And so we're challenged with accessing capital to do the work and build our great work here at Build Wealth Minnesota. You're somewhat familiar with. We put well over 3,000 families in the home ownership, have been addressing the wealth divide, but when trying to take this great programming to scale, getting the adequate capital from different sources to take it to scale, they're not always there. As I stated earlier, I think that having different types of lending products that show a little more favoritism, but have good compensating factor and risk mitigation strategies with them to help families get into home ownership to kind of level the playing field are critical at this time. We've gotten some started. We've gotten some folks that are interested. I know the former Commissioner Tinkerthal, Mary Tinkerthal, had opened up the door to trying some things, and taking our model and operationalizing it through Minnesota Housing has helped quite a few organizations around the state begin to try to address these issues. And the new commissioner, Ho, is now seems to be open to helping and coming alongside with us and advocating for additional resources. Right now, we're, as you said, the state has a surplus right now, and we're hoping that we can expand. We do get some direct appropriations. They're rather small, but we think it's a good opportunity right now for more to invest in this area. We've got some national stakeholders and some other organizations and folks in the philanthropic community that are seeing about impact investing and doing investing at a different level, where we're doing multi-year financing and gifting and allowing, building up our equity and building up our balance sheet to be able to leverage to bring more resources to the programming that's really been effective and is proven to be working. It's proven to be working, and the University of Minnesota has validated our work, and it's been doing great work. And so we're going to need capacity, and also we need to replicate this opportunity and these delivery models to others that are going to deliver this to help address these disparities in our state.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, David. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Over 3,000 people put into homeownership, a tool for building wealth. But I want to underscore that the points that you raised here of the need for us to be intentional about the who and the how, and to invest. We often talk about inclusive investing, inclusive capital, even equitable capital. We are in the business of driving responsive capital, meaning that if we have a challenge that is exacerbated by decades of poverty caused by our policies, then we have to invest not just equal, not even just equitable, but really responsive to the challenge that we're trying to solve for, not just the current status, but that history. And all funders, whether you're in the banking sector, in philanthropy, public sector, and government, have to be thinking about that. Commissioner Doty, I want to come over to you now before we go to our questions from our audience. We've got lots coming in, so we encourage people to use the Q&A button on your screens to drop those questions in, because we're going to go into those just after this question. Commissioner, as the legislative session is getting underway right now in just a couple of days more, what are you able to share with us about the opportunity to address the administration's priorities and how those priorities, particularly related to this realm, will be closing the stagnant racial wealth gaps we have in our state?
Thank you, Tawana. First of all, as you said, the legislative session will be starting fairly soon. We're all getting ready for that. And you also know that the governor right now is in the process of releasing his full budget and the proposals related to that for the 22 legislative session. The full budget will be actually released on Wednesday, and we'll all be able to take a closer look at that. But the idea, with regard to the idea of advancing equity in policy and administration, remains a solid commitment from the Walz administration. And this from both the Governor Walz as well as Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. This commitment was outlined originally in the governor's One Minnesota plan. And I think that it's very clear that the idea of advancing equity is a strong pillar of that overall plan. So I think that advancing equity and some of these issues continue to be something that is important for the governor. I will say that of what has been released, two proposals that I think I can definitely speak about that I think are related to some of the discussion here. First of all, the governor is proposing an expansion of the child and dependent care credit, and this would increase the income threshold for this credit would be increased from 51,000 to up to 70,000, and this would make more families eligible for that credit. And actually, an additional 21,000 additional families would actually be eligible for the credit. The proposal would also update the Minnesota newborn credit, which is available, which would be available for all taxpayers, regardless of marital status. And this point right here is very consistent with the points that Dorothy Brown was making around marriage and how marriage has really kind of been used to support inequity, quite frankly. And currently, Minnesotans who have a newborn during the tax year are able to offset some of those costs with this credit, as long as they're married. So Governor Walsh's proposal would eliminate that requirement. So that's actually exciting. And then the other one is actually an expansion of the K-12 education credit. And as you know, this credit allows Minnesota families to receive a credit for some educational expenses. And so this proposal would increase the income threshold up to $70,000 as well. Again, allowing more families to be eligible for this credit. In fact, this would allow almost 39,000 additional households to be eligible. So those are two kind of examples of some of the proposals that the governor will be unveiling, or releasing, I should say, not unveiling, but releasing as we get closer to the legislative session. But I think it's really the point I just really want to make sure that I stress is that this governor and this administration have clearly put equity as an important point in what they do, and they live that. And so I think that comes across. So that's a real important point I want to make sure that I mention.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I, again, underscore the leadership that's taking place within your office and within the administration, and also invite and remind our listeners, our partners who are here with us today, it takes all of us driving shared accountability for government policies and actions that will fuel our economic growth in ways that are racially inclusive and equitable. So please be talking to these leaders. We're bringing them and creating a platform for them so that we can have these open communication lines and invest in that community relations that you mentioned earlier that'll be coming out into communities so that the information is flowing two ways. I'm excited to bring Dorothy back into this conversation right now. We've got lots of questions that are coming into our Q&A. So let's jump right into them, excuse me, right now. This first question I'm going to ask is one that's really important, because I think often we have conversations about racial equity and inclusion, and it moves to a place of class because we're particularly comfortable as decision makers, employers, policymakers with creating policies that address poverty to some extent. Can you talk to us? I'll start with Dorothy and then open it up for conversation about the overlap in the solutions you're elevating and even the identification of problems in how it impacts people who are poor, who might be poor and African-American, but might not be, versus the impacts that are specifically about race, where we see tax policy that has race built in, and are some of the solutions we're talking about here today going to solve for the racism issue in addition to classism?
So the book I wrote looks at Black Americans at all different income levels. And what I learned is middle-class Black Americans pay higher taxes than their white peers. I see with lower income Black Americans disadvantaged by race. So from my perspective, racial disparity is at all income levels. Even high income Black Americans pay higher taxes than their white peers because they are less likely to invest in the stock market. And one very famous high income Black American that is an example of this is Barack Obama. When he was president, I waited with bated breath for the tax returns that he produced. And what his high income showed, one year he made $5 million, mainly from royalty, which is royalty income from his books, which is taxed the same way as wages. The typical $5 million household is a household that has a significant percentage of income from the stock market that's taxed at lower rates. And the Obamas didn't have a lot of income from the stock market. So from my perspective, race is a disadvantage at all income levels. So one of the solutions I put in my book was, I call it a reparations tax credit. It would be designed to compensate Black Americans for decades of paying higher taxes. But I also talk about the fact that that wouldn't be upheld as constitutional. So my alternative is a wealth tax credit, which would flow to any household with below median wealth, which would include all households regardless of race. So that was a solution I put in the book that would impact anyone with low wealth, which means it would benefit white Americans as well as Black Americans, as well as Indigenous Americans, Asian Americans, Latina Americans. So it would impact all Americans. So when I started writing about race, I always got the class questions, which made me write about race and class. And what I find is, regardless of class, race overshadows it.
Race overshadows it. We find this to be the case with many different policies. Commissioner, I want to come over to you for a moment. You've elevated several opportunities here for us. How are you making sure that race isn't overshadowed by class, but we have measurable results we can track and maintain over time? And you've elevated some of these things, but I think our audience, if we look at the questions, are wondering, okay, will it go far enough such that we're ensuring all of the classes that have been impacted by racist policy are impacted through the new solutions coming out of Minnesota?
Sure. You know, what I would say is that, well, first of all, I'm looking at some of the work that we're doing as some of the first steps, quite frankly. I am not looking at what this work as being the end all, quite frankly. I mean, I think, you know, we're going to do our best to use census information, census data, as we overlay some of that with our tax system information, so that we can zero in, quite frankly, on race. Our work will allow us to specifically look at areas within the state where there are high concentrations of ethnic minorities, immigrant populations, et cetera. And so we will be focusing on that. I mean, that is definitely going to be where our a major emphasis for us. I mean, you know, I have to acknowledge, though, as I think that Dorothy Brown said, I mean, the intersection, though, between class and race is so tight that that's gonna be something that a challenge that we're gonna have to continue to figure out how best to deal with, and to keep that in the forefront of our work. I don't know if I have a great solution that allows us to separate that so easily, but it's definitely something that we have to acknowledge and continue our work to focus on that.
I appreciate that, Commissioner, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge, right? We won't solve all of these things tomorrow or in this session, because they weren't created in one session. And more than that, they've been compounded with a lot of support and investment through more policies that make it even more complex. And yet, not talking about the difference in some of these policies and how they're impacting communities of color, African Americans into the middle class, keeps us at a conversation that often doesn't win us the day, right? We're able to appear that we're making the same thing. I know I've read, Dorothy, and heard you talk about the income appearance as opposed to the wealth reality. And this comes up in our work a lot, that we see each other and think, oh, well, they're making the same thing I am. They have access to the same benefits that I do. Few people inside large corporations know how many of their employees are not actually accessing benefits because they can't. They're in what are classified as temporary jobs. So there are all these things that can become, I used to call it in my consulting, the elevator or lunchroom phenomenon, where we look and say, well, the elevator looks diverse, the lunchroom looks diverse. I got good benefits, I got a good salary, it's good for me here. It must be good for everyone. And we need more intentional policy. I want to come over to you, David, for a moment, and then come over to Nan about this question of how you're seeing families build wealth, and what do you think about these policy ideas? What more can we be doing from a public policy standpoint, and what should employers be doing in order to start to change what is a real drastic need here?
I think creating systems that by any means necessary that can level the playing field. I mean, I'm working with families as a practitioner I would put families with zero incomes into six figures. And similar to what Dorothy had stated, we're finding the challenges go across all income levels. There's a conditioning that we've gone through as African Americans and Black people. There's been a condition that's gone on for generations. It's going to take us, more generations just to catch up. And so there's going to be the need to invest in different types of opportunities to educate people about systems, good and bad systems, and how they impact us all the way up the spectrum of income. And we've got families that are making six-figure incomes that are still doing practices of folks that are at lower income levels. As a matter of fact, folks at lower income levels have found a way to be better stewards over resources, savings, of utilizing products and services. Our goal here is to build sustainable social and economic wealth and lower the cost of money by helping people to navigate through systems that have gone on for generations. And when you haven't been conditioned from generations prior or almost at birth on how to navigate through economic systems properly, we see wealth being drained out of our communities, and the folks who got more money, that means more wealth is being drained out of them because they were never really conditioned about how to, as you spoke about earlier, Dorothy, invest in the stock market, looking at different investment opportunities. We know that home ownership is the number one way of building wealth, but there's so many other traditional ways of utilizing other tools to build wealth for our families that there was a time where I would look at, and I consider myself a finance guru, but there was a time where I was so conditioned when I seen the investment page that talked about the indices and things in the stock market. I thought that was for white guys. I didn't think that was even for me, as though I'm a finance major. However, the conditioning of the history of my family made it appear that that was not even a place that I should be engaged in. I'm teaching people today, we fuel economies. Black people, we're some of the biggest consumers on the planet. We set trends for spending money. And so being able to understand that, we fuel economies. And we really don't grasp that or begin to train that. I mean, at fifth grade level, all the way up through college level, there's a repositioning that we have to take into consideration. We have to invest in that kind of deep economic and social, I think, comprehensive approach to being able to educate us about these systems going forward.
You're hitting the nail on the head. I appreciate that, the underscoring of it takes money to have money. It's going to be an expensive challenge to move up that economic ladder. And the more clear we can be about how that is impacting African Americans, what those differences are, and how they're rooted in these historic policies and the price to pay is so important. Nan, what are you thinking about right now as you consider the policies that your organization is not only advocated for, but helped to design and get instilled in our communities? And yet this gap, as it relates, that is specifically a racial gap, but shows up differently across income spectrums, but certainly is hitting the middle class. What could our state be doing differently?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a lot of what this discussion today has led me to reflect on how I've looked at my work for a long time just through the lens of income and how much is missed when we do that. There definitely are tax policies that can be powerful tools for advancing racial equity. Earned income tax credit is just one example, but we can't assume that our policies that are well targeted by income are necessarily going to reach all groups of people or reach them with the same ease. So I think a lot more intentionality around our policy development, really testing that we're having the impact, and having more folks brought into that conversation and the policy design, because while it was mentioned earlier, there's a strong correlation between income and race, but we've definitely got to dig in further and make sure that the policies are reaching the folks who are just left out in so many ways. When we don't do that, we're just compounding the disparities that already exist in the system. And I think just one final thing I'd mention too is while there's so much we need to do in tax policy, often tax policy is not necessarily the best or most direct route to solve these problems. And I really appreciate Dorothy Brown, in your book, you talk about things about like savings for college and how people pay off student loans. But if we just really were funding Pell Grants and financial aid at the level they should be, that would be a really direct way and perhaps an easier path to college affordability than doing a lot more complexity about the tax code.
Appreciate that, Nan. I want to come back over to you, Dorothy, and open up for some conversation. I appreciate that you ended, Nan, talking about our graduation rates and our education and affordability and the research that you've done. Dr. Brown continues to elevate the importance of us understanding even there, right? Who's graduating, where are they graduating from, and where is policy contributed to those hindrances and barriers that then prepare us to go get those good jobs, the jobs that pay benefits based on our tax structure and allow people to move up not only the income ladder and the title and the social status, but the wealth ladder. Talk to us about how you're responding to these things and specifically what policies. We've got a couple of state policymakers who are here, others who are wrestling with, okay, what should I be advocating for as I design bills right now?
Well, I think Nan talked about Pell Grants getting funded. So to the extent Minnesota is funding grants for college or otherwise helping students make college more affordability, focusing on low income students, prospective students would be a really good way to go. One of the things I haven't talked about that I think is really important is the research that shows when you look at college graduates, Black college graduates are more likely to send money to their parents, grandparents, and extended family, whereas white college graduates are more likely to receive money in the form of gifts and inheritances from their parents. So you could have, two next door neighbors, one Black, one white, making the same amount of income, but they don't have the same ability to pay because the Black worker who has a good paying job is making sure that their grandparent is not evicted or making sure that their parent has enough money to pay for the electricity bill or making sure that a cousin is making rent. So there are draws on Black Americans because of Jim Crow and because of other systems that have discriminated against our parents and grandparents that prevent us from investing in the stock market, right? We have to have money in order to invest it. And a lot of us don't have money, not because we're throwing it away or consuming extra amounts. It's because we have family members who are in dire need because they didn't have a good paying job. They weren't able to save and build, so that's a problem. And when you think about, what a solution would look like, when we think about the tax law around who can take a dependent exemption and who can't, right? So if I'm not, let me be clear, Miss Doty can take care of herself, right? But if I were sending money to my mother because she doesn't live with me, I wouldn't be able to get a tax break for that. Well, maybe there's something that the state legislature could do to enable those taking care of extended family members to get a tax break.
Absolutely love that and appreciate the data that it's grounded in. I think we convene here at the Center Anti-Racism and Economic Justice Trust, and I am struck by one of our earliest meetings where suddenly on the call, someone dropped that line of like, yeah, I'm sending back 25% of my income to Oklahoma, to Atlanta. And suddenly every person of color on the call had the, oh shoot, I thought that was only in the Jamaican community. I thought that was only in the Asian community. I thought that was only here. And we all had that in common on that call. Our white peers on the call did not have that in common. And while we know that instinctively, seeing the data in that helps us start to think about what penalty is that for folks who may be, to David's point, six-figure earners, but are still paying a heavy tax and have built up the habits, because I know his program would teach us to undo some of those habits, but built up the habits of this is how we survive and we prosper, that doesn't show up when we just look at, okay, who has what job and what title. I want to go over to policy a little more deeply. I love that this group is big on policy, and we have a huge opportunity in our state to go even deeper in our state and other states that are here on the call today. First, we want to look at the data. Is this data being collected? You talked about earlier, Dorothy, that it was hard to go, you had to become a detective. Is this a case where those entities who have an opportunity to collect data are collecting it, but not reporting on it? Or is this a case where we aren't even asking the right questions at the federal level or at our state level that would allow us to garner the data? And is that someplace that our advocates, our organizations here who are lobbying, our corporations who want to align their lobbying with racial equity should be leaning in?
Oh, absolutely. So part of it, it's interesting. There were two Treasury reports that looked at race because the researcher involved wanted to look at race. There were opportunities for Treasury to look at race, but chose not to. So it seems to have been only if one person was interested would they do it, right? So part of it is you have to make it a requirement. You have to make the federal government satisfy or comply with President Biden's racial equity order, and the Treasury doesn't get a pass and the IRS doesn't get a pass. So state governments can step up and show the federal government how to do it, quite frankly, right? They can get the data and they can analyze it and they can say, it's not rocket science, because what we've seen with respect to the Treasury and IRS is outside researchers have been able to do it. Think tanks have been able to do it. How is it the people that are hired to deal with statistics can't figure out how to do it? They don't want to. So they need to be pushed into doing it. And I think states can take a real leadership role here.
Absolutely. I want to elevate that to that point. We've got a state policymaker here with us. Thank you so much, Representative Gomez, for being here with us, who says when we try to craft critical public policy that addresses race, we run into the barriers of equal protection, or at least that's what's put out there is equal protection. Do you have recommendations on ways that we can be explicit in our language, be intentional about whom we are seeking to serve or to benefit, or is that even the right approach that helps us get around this? And we often are forced to use the class as a proxy, which doesn't actually get us where we're trying to go. Can you give us some insight? She lifts up an example here in the chat of HUD special purpose credit ruling, which might help us make targeted investments in home ownerships, but interested in any general thoughts about how we can avoid that being the trap that keeps us from moving the needle.
So first of all, collecting data is not discriminatory, right? The federal government does this every day. So anyone who pushes back on your collecting data, the easy response is, you can collect data in California where there's a Prop 209. It isn't racially discriminatory to ask everybody for data. You're not just saying, I want the Black people to give me data. You want all people to give you data. It's what you do next that raises the equal protection challenge. But step one, can we get the data and figure out what's going on and then think about how we can improve it? And there are ways to craft policies that will have a disproportionate impact to benefit Black and Brown taxpayers, like improving Pell Grants, because a disproportionate percent of Black and Brown students benefit from it, right? White students do as well. So step one, getting the data, there's no racial equal protection challenge that will stop you from getting the data.
Really appreciate that. I want to close out with an opportunity for each one of you to reflect something back that you think our listeners need to go and take action on today, whether they're an employer, a peer, an advocate, a voter, whatever seat you find yourself in today. What should folks be thinking about in order to address this in the places and spaces they influence? I'll start with you, Commissioner. You're on mute, Commissioner.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. I really appreciate this. Has been a phenomenal discussion, and thank you to Dorothy for your work and for your comments. I would say the thing that I would want to stress as we conclude for me is really about involvement and really getting involved. We need, one of the things that is a big part of the work we're doing at Revenue, as you heard me mention earlier, is trying to make sure that we're engaging with communities. We need their input. We need they have to be involved in policy formulation, administration. They have to be involved there. We have a lot of individuals, groups that provide us with ongoing input all the time. And a lot of times they aren't from these communities at all. And so we need people to be involved, to to deal with us. I mean, a lot of times at the Department of Revenue, people don't really want to always deal with us. And so we're working to change that, but we need involvement and people to be open to these discussions that we're trying to have.
Commissioner, thank you for that. A quick question. We have a question in there, and Tracy, thank you, has answered some of it about specifically, will that office that you're creating to be able to focus on community engagement be representative of all of the different racial and ethnic groups?
Yes, it will be. I've been highlighting just some real general groups, but yes, it will absolutely represent all racial ethnic groups.
Excellent, thank you. Nan?
Yeah, I think I really just would like to emphasize that now is the time for racial equity to be part of the discussion in our tax debate. For too long, there's been this assumption that tax and race don't have anything to do with each other, and that's really allowed our tax laws to compound the disparities and in our economy and protects the racial wealth gap instead of pushing back against it. So it's time to really unleash this tool for equity.
Thank you so much. David?
Yeah, I just I'm hopeful that, I mean, tax is so complicated, and this information and this data needs to be disseminated, broken down, and easily articulated to our communities of all races, so that we can understand it. It's got to be, we've got to be able to see it, understand it, enhance it, and be able to advocate for it and navigate through it and use it to our benefit. It shouldn't be rocket science, which tax is. We might as well be speaking another language a lot of times. This data is so hidden, and you policymakers should make it and put it in a way where we can understand it and bring it down to the grassroots level, so I can use it in order to help my family really build wealth, avoid high costs, and use it to bring about change going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks for the work that you do. And in particular, elevating that need for all of us to have enough information that it pushes us to recognize these opportunities are all of ours and we can't opt out. I'm going to end with you, Dorothy Brown.
So I would talk to the employers and people who run non-for-profits to do a racial equity audit, to look at your employees and to see if there are any differences in pay based on race, if there are any differences in benefits being offered, and fix that and then move on, right? So a lot of nonprofits do work in this space, but they often don't look internally to see what they are doing to exacerbate the racial wealth gap. So racial equity begins at home.
Now that put me on mute. Absolutely does. Thank you all so much for joining us. I have to underscore that point as one of our first ones, those audits, those indices that help employers, no matter what sector you're in, know not only who's your makeup and who's inside your four walls, but how do the policies and practices that you have that are embedded into your systems, how are those showing up and working for your employees and their efforts to build economic prosperity, or how are they hindering? At the Center for Economic Inclusion, we have what is, I think, the leading product here in the nation that connects race, class, those decisions to our economic prosperity and the policies and decisions that employers must take. In our racial equity dividends assessment, Jonathan Johnson and Nathan Arnasti are on the line. You can message them directly if you want more interest in that. And if you want to start with a lighter touch index to be able to understand how you're moving the needle inside your business on the leading indicators and standards of anti-racist workplaces, our racial equity dividends index, all these words, opened up last week, and employers can sign up for that on our website as well. I want to say a big thank you to my partners and guests who joined us on today. This has been a riveting hour. We could stay here for another 3 hours on talking about tax policy, and we commit to continuing to elevate this information to our partners. I want to say now to you all a big thank you and encourage you to join us again. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, we are going to be together every Thursday at noon, just as we were last year, reckoning to rise together. And we want you to register now to participate in those. The series starts off next Thursday with a powerful discussion that will build on some of our comments here on the impact of women in our economy as we bring Melissa Bradley from 1863 Ventures in with some amazing guests to talk about the importance of investing in businesses owned by women of color. You don't want to miss that conversation and the opportunity to go deeper with us, and a special announcement that'll come from our organization about how we'll be investing in businesses owned by women of color this year with our partners. You can register for that workshop and all of our workshops on our website. We want to encourage you to continue to share this information out with other people, continue the social online chat with us, and raise questions and information that you want to learn more about as well. I want to now also elevate an opportunity for business owners of color, particularly women business owners of color. Comcast Rise is investing in our communities. They're committed and have been a partner and sponsor of the Center for Economic Inclusion. And Comcast Rise has now issued another opportunity for businesses who are owned by women to be receiving grant funds. So please take advantage of that. I talked a moment ago about our index and want to continue to lift that up for you. The Racial Equity Dividends Index assesses the leading indicators and standards of economic growth and prosperity and how we embed our values into things like our budgets and our policies. It's open now for registration. We encourage everyone to not only participate, but all those places where you spend your dollars, from your dry cleaner, your groceries, the places that you know and trust, encourage them to build trust with our communities of color by participating in the index and bringing transparency and rigor to our efforts to build inclusion, moving us from a place of values and awareness to true accountability. I want to close out by saying a big thank you again to the Department of Revenue and our sponsors for partnering with us on today. A huge debt of gratitude to all of our speakers who have so much intel to share with us and are working with us. And a thank you to you for doing the hard work. We encourage you to take our survey that's available in the chat for you now so that you can give us intel, not only about today's experience, but what you need from us as your partners in building an economy that truly works for everyone. Thank you so much.